May the power of Christ compel you. I'm your host, Ahead of the Curve, aka James Bergman, and in this book review, I will be discussing Catherine Nixey's The Darkening Age, first published in 2017. So for those who are unaware of what the premise of this piece is, a bold new history of the rise of Christianity, showing its radical followers ravaged vast swathes of classical culture, plunging the world into an era of dogma and intellectual darkness. From this synopsis on the back of the book alone, we can already tell that Catherine Nixey has a definite bias against Christianity when she's writing this as a historian. The interesting thing about how this book is written is that, in a good way, it's written as if it's this story, as if it's some kind of narrative. And I feel like with a lot of history books, it's really difficult to get into and really difficult to follow along because it's so dry and you just don't care about some of it because history is so diverse and we all have our niches of interest. But what Catherine Nixey does throughout this book, which you could argue is a detriment, and some people have, but I think that it does a favour to the book, because when you're reading history, like I'm saying, it does get dry. But the thing that Nixey does throughout is give the content a narrative, a forward structure, and it makes it that much more interesting to follow along because it's told in this way that is engaging, and there's a lot of sources as well that are referenced as well, so it's not like she's just making it up. And this is another thing that I wanted to talk about, because history is just such an elusive topic, right? Like what Harari says in Sapiens, history is always told with a certain bias, with a certain narrative, and it's always revealed by the victors of that time. The survivors are the ones who have to tell that story. And so, yeah, a lot of people have come to me and they've said, well, the book is really unreliable and it's kind of a waste of time because Nixey has a bias and she misinterprets sources and it's just the text is dubious, apparently. And then on the other hand, and this is the thing on Goodreads as well, like either people absolutely love this book or they don't because they happen to be Christians or they happen to just be dubious of the historical work. But interestingly, this was actually recommended to me by a friend who studies history. And so I don't really think that they would recommend me something, you know, the top book, let's say, that was inaccurate. But not to say that they can't do that, but to back up the point even more, publishing companies don't even allow books to be published with false sources. I mean, that just doesn't happen. When it comes to the interpretation of the sources, because whilst the source might be reliable, that doesn't necessarily mean that the interpretation is true. And that is the central problem with this book, as people say. But as far as I'm concerned, Catherine Nixey obviously has this bias, but at the same time, she's not trying to hide it either. She's honest about it. But the thing is that what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to, read a book instead written by a Christian? I mean, we already have those books. It's not that I don't want to read it. I actually would want to read a book on this topic of paganism and the overthrow of paganism from the Christians, or done by the Christians. I plan to read a book by a Christian on this topic to get both sides of the argument. But the thing is, either way you can't win, because either way, the Christianity was in the right here, or it wasn't. And there is middle ground as well. Like, Catherine Nixey writes as if there is middle ground. Like, they didn't do every single bad thing under the sun that they possibly could have done. I mean, of course, there were bad things done by these Christian-inspired individuals at the time. Like Augustine, he did many dubious things as well, which was brought to my attention within this book. But yeah, I just want to address this whole idea of this book is not worth reading because Catherine Nixey misinterprets sources and her points are dubious. And yes, that might be true, but surely you could say the same about a Christian scholar, because she also wrote this book, apparently in the introduction, precisely because the history of Christianity's rise is always brought up in this sort of smiling prose of like, oh, well, they were doing everybody a favour. Well, maybe. Maybe they were. But the story of how many pagans were put into torture and killed, the philosophers who were shunned, the books that were burnt or written over, which happened a lot, that happened on numerous occasions. And the thing is, when this is brought up and there's a source, how can you interpret a book literally being written over as a misinterpretation? Like, how can that even be a misinterpretation? Like, it either happened or it didn't. Either a book was overwritten or it wasn't. And of course, the cause behind that is questionable, perhaps. But then my point is that there are some things that you can misinterpret, but to say that the entire book, this was the case, is just an absurd claim. And so I have both crowds telling me this book is unreliable or it's really, really good. And hopefully I haven't mumbled or tumbled too much throughout the beginning of this video. But I thought I'd want to get that past the door or past the line, because I really enjoyed this book. To those who already know me, you're going to say, well, obviously you will say that. And maybe I would, because I am an agnostic atheist, for those who don't already know. And so the claim can be made that I'm jumping on the bandwagon as well. I mean, maybe. I mean, I obviously have that confirmation bias. So, but the very fact remains that either way you're going to have bias, and either way you're going to have some sort of side being taken. And I feel that this book needed to be written because it was on the side of those who were technically just oppressed, and those who are just glossed over by the beauty and the revelation of Christianity over the land. Like, we have books already talking about how great Christianity is. And so where's the harm in viewing the other side of the story here? And that's what I enjoyed about this book. It was telling a story, or I suppose it's called like the untold story of how Christianity overthrew paganism, or the other side, basically. So yeah, this has been a tangent so far, but I thought this was important to preface the video with, because if you haven't read this book, or if you have, I think it's equally important, because yes, there is a bias, but there is always going to be one for a historical piece. There just always is going to be one. So don't be so persuaded by those saying one thing or the other, because you can't win when it's history. You literally can't win. You just have to read as much content on one thing as possible to get a rounded view. And if you want to get a rounded view of the negatives that happened to the pagans by Christianity, this book, I maintain, is a brilliant one. I enjoyed nearly every second of reading this piece. I found it to be, as I said, the narrative was very, very engaging. It wasn't really dry. There was a bit of repetitiveness, and the chapters were interesting and very short, very punchy. And like I said, the sources are abundant throughout the piece, and if you want to research them, you can. But yeah, I was overly impressed with the piece. I was just engaged through and through with it. I think that Nixey just did a great job of documenting the other side, the untold side, and I'm pressing that because that's important. There are a lot of things. I mean, I read The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang a few months ago, and my review is up for those who haven't seen it. And that is an untold story of what happened to the Chinese in Nanking for 8 weeks. It was a terrible massacre. I think that these kind of books displaying a history that is untold are very, very important, because history has all of these victims, and we should at least try and acknowledge them. Obviously, there are a lot of things brought up throughout the book, but one historical figure that I want to bring up is Celsus. He was the Christopher Hitchens of the ancient world against Christianity or monotheism. He is endlessly entertaining, as Nixey writes about him and quotes his books, which were mostly seized and destroyed, by the way. But I find it ironic, or I found it ironic, how, and I can't remember his name now, but a Christian wrote a book about Celsus's arguments, and funnily enough, we actually have his arguments preserved in that book. So the Christian essentially brought back the writings that were previously destroyed, or later destroyed, and put them in his book. So basically, we have the work of Celsus through this Christian's rebuttal of Celsus. And yeah, I just found that to be very interesting. And this is the thing, a lot of different nuances are brought up within the book, and there's so much to explain, so much to go through. But obviously, this isn't the type of video that's going through every single bit. It's more of my opinion about how I found it and if I'd recommend it, which I would, if you haven't already guessed. But Celsus also talks about Jesus and how his miracles are banal because lots of people were documented to have miracles, or how you define them. A lot of people would miraculously turn things into food or drink. And so miracles of this kind were not unheard of in the ancient world. And I suppose I find that to be a very good argument, because when we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, the only difference there between a spontaneous miracle and not is that the miracles that Jesus attributed in the New Testament, they were in a way backed up by religio-historical evidence found in the Old Testament predictions. So I must admit, there is a counter-argument to be made of Celsus's point there about miracles, because Jesus's miracles or his actions were actually predetermined, predestined by the Old Testament, whereas miraculous ones out of the blue have not been. So I suppose there is some validity there on part of Christianity. But yeah, I'm just bringing up that random point because I personally just found it very interesting, that whole debate of what makes a genuine miracle. And yeah, I mean, Celsus is a guy that I want to read now, so I will check him out. And also Augustine, he's just brought up a lot, but also unfavorably as well, like I mentioned earlier. As I said, he made some very, very dubious and shocking claims about the pagans, basically mandating their destruction and defacing the statues of the polytheistic gods and so on. Just a lot of different modes of destruction were mandated at the time, and the Bible even, of course, says to do these things explicitly at points. But a case can be made for the individual Christians making bad decisions, and I'm all for that. I think that we have to separate the text, the scripture, from how it is interpreted and acted out by that believer. I'm all on board with that. I'm completely happy to concede that. But at times, the scripture is just as bad as the people who act it out. Something that I also found interesting was the commentary on how civilized the pagans actually were. I mean, of course, there were things like watching public deaths and so on, but at the same time, they were very sort of friendly. I mean, for example, philosophers could just walk around in the city, Alexandria, let's say, in Egypt, and they could freely question things. They could freely have this dialogue. And when paganism was overthrown, or when these places were overthrown by Christianity, of course there was more, I suppose, moral imperative from this objective claim of goodness, of God, of Jesus. So of course there was that moral imperative, that objective morality claim. But at the same time, a lot of people were shunned in many different ways as well. So this is what I've said before. As many good things that you can count on your hand that is good about the implementation of Christianity on a society, you know, there are 10 more things, or the same amount of things, that are really, really oppressive and bad about it. Like banning homosexuality. Like, people were very sexually fluent back then. And it was just completely banned when Christianity took hold, because the Bible says homosexuality is unacceptable, even though it does no harm to anyone, by the way. This is the thing. It's like for every, I suppose, useful commandment, there is just some banal, undermining, unintelligent, uninspiring mandate to say something that is unnecessary overall, and if not frightening. As I'm expressing here, I agree that there are many good things that came about from Christianity's overhaul of the ancient world, but I think we have to remember what is written in this book and what actually came about. I mean, as Nixey says, many pagans were willing to turn to Christianity. Many were, because they read the Bible and there was now an objective reason to live and to be good, and that there was a mandate on life, whereas paganism doesn't offer that. Paganism just offers different gods and causes of things in the naturalistic world, whereas Christianity offers a mode of living, a behavioral shift, a routine of living and thought. And so people may have been starving for that kind of objective meaning. But on the other hand, many obviously were very satisfied with what they were doing anyway. So again, the argument can be made both ways, and this is the thing. For all you could say about this book being biased, and whatever you want to say about it, it does show you another side of how Christianity forced people over to the faith, and if not, pillaged them and killed them, defaced their statues and such, if they did not comply. Yeah, I want to express specifically that I see both sides here, but I just don't like the fact that this book can be pointed at in saying that, oh, well, it's all just propaganda against Christianity. Well, it's like, well, maybe. But does that mean that the book is wrong? Those are two separate questions. And of course, you could say the exact same claim about any Christian writing a book about this same topic, but more on the side of Christianity. So yeah, there's not much else I want to say about this piece. I haven't really gone into, obviously, everything that the book has got to offer, because it's, you know, it's a history book. It has so much content. And I'm obviously just talking about what I personally enjoyed and such. Yeah, I mean, I'd recommend it highly. If you're a Christian or atheist, it doesn't particularly matter, because it still gives you that other side of the argument. Of course, if you want to, you can check out the sources for yourself and see if they are accurate or not. This is all up to the reader. All I will say is just don't stick on one side of the agenda. Read the contrary opinion of your favourite books. Read the content that you don't necessarily think you will agree with, because by knowing the arguments against our belief is either debunked, and we can have to admit that and accept that and to move forward, or we can be more sure that our beliefs and our opinions and so on are much more solidified by that process. So in a way, it's a win-win, although if it completely crumbles your entire belief system, then maybe it isn't too ethical for you to come to that realization. Anyway, I've been Ahead of the Curve. Glad that you stayed until the end of this somewhat rambling review, but I hope you found it informative or interesting at the very least. Subscribe if you're new here and leave a like either way. That really does help the algorithm on YouTube, my channel. I've been your host, Ahead of the Curve. I will see you in the next video.